The young pilot floated out of the shuttle, the hiss of the airlock echoing in his ears as the dim lights of the station reflected off the polished metal floor. He had never been to a place so isolated. The hum of engines and distant clanging of machinery felt like whispers of forgotten stories. His boots made soft thuds as he stepped onto the dock, and the faint vibration beneath him reminded him that the station was alive, breathing with a rhythm all its own. He adjusted his suit, pulling the collar higher against the cool, recycled air that smelled faintly of ozone and metal. He could see the docking bay stretching endlessly to either side, rows of cargo crates stacked like silent giants, and pipes running along the ceiling like veins carrying some vital fluid to the heart of the station. The shadows shifted around him as he walked deeper into the hallways, the walls lined with panels blinking softly in red and blue lights. The station felt empty, but he knew that emptiness could hide many things. A shiver ran down his spine, and he could not tell if it was the cold or the expectation of what was waiting. He remembered the orders from command to meet the widow immediately and report any anomalies, but the words sounded hollow now as the weight of isolation pressed against his mind. He reached the observation deck, a large circular room with windows stretching from floor to ceiling, revealing the endless expanse of stars beyond the station. The cosmos seemed closer here, like he could reach out and brush his hand across the glittering tapestry of distant suns. He stepped closer to the glass, feeling the hum of the engines through his feet, and for a moment he forgot the mission, the orders, and the rules. He was just a small figure suspended in a void where time slowed, and the silence was so thick he could hear his own heartbeat. Then he saw her. She emerged from a side corridor, her movement fluid and confident, her spacesuit catching the light and reflecting a spectrum of colors that danced across the floor. He could not tell if she had been waiting or if she had appeared from the shadows like a ghost. She paused for a moment, looking at him, her eyes sharp and unreadable. His chest tightened, and he struggled to find words or even to move his legs. He felt like a child caught staring at something forbidden, something precious and powerful. The widow walked closer, each step measured and silent, and he noticed the insignias on her suit, the marks of experience, the scars of past journeys that he could not yet comprehend. His curiosity battled with caution, and he wondered if the stories of her late husband, the tragedies that had shaped her, were true, or just whispers meant to intimidate newcomers. The air between them was thick with tension, a mix of awe, fear, and something that felt dangerously like fascination. He wanted to speak, and yet he held his tongue, the words tangled in his throat like wires shorting in the dark. He could hear the faint hiss of her breathing through her helmet, and it matched his own rapid pulse. His mind raced, trying to predict her next move, but she seemed to move with a purpose that was beyond his understanding. He realized that the first step of this mission was not to report anomalies or scan the station. It was to survive the encounter, to endure the presence of the widow, whose gaze seemed to pierce through the suit, through the metal, through the air itself, and into the very core of his thoughts. He did not yet know if he was ready. The widow stopped a few meters away from the young pilot, her posture straight and deliberate, as if every movement was measured by some unseen standard. He could feel the air shift around her, the temperature seemed to drop, and the hum of the station grew louder in his ears. Her eyes never left his face, and he felt the weight of her scrutiny pressing against his chest. He tried to stand taller, but the stiffness in his suit made him feel awkward and exposed. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture so small, yet so deliberate, that it carried a weight of intent. He sensed that she was testing him, sizing him up for reasons he could not yet understand. The young pilot swallowed hard, his throat dry, and his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He wanted to speak, to break the silence, but the words seemed inadequate and fragile against the enormity of her presence. The observation deck was quiet, except for the distant thrumming of the engines and the soft clicks of machinery somewhere deep in the station. It felt like the stars themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. He noticed the way her suit shimmered under the soft light, reflecting tiny bursts of color across the metal floor, and he felt a surge of curiosity that he struggled to contain. His mind wanted to focus on the mission, the instructions, the purpose of his journey, but it kept returning to her, the enigma in the suit, and the sharp intelligence in her eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, and even carrying a weight that made him straighten instinctively. "Is your mind always on what's inside my spacesuit?" She did not ask it like a question seeking an answer. She asked it like a challenge, a statement designed to test the boundaries of his composure. The words hung in the air, and the young pilot felt the heat rise to his cheeks, as if the temperature of the room had shifted with her tone. opened his mouth to answer, and nothing came out. His thoughts jumbled. Like the circuits of a malfunctioning terminal, the widow took a slow step closer, and the metallic plates of her suit gleamed in the soft light, revealing details he had not noticed before, the tiny scratches and dents that told stories of past voyages, the insignias, marking achievements and losses alike. He felt a strange mixture of admiration and fear, as if he were standing before someone who could unravel him with a single glance. The young pilot realized that the question was more than it seemed. It was not about curiosity or desire, it was about trust and self-control, about understanding that the station demanded more than skill or courage. It demanded awareness and the ability to face someone who had walked through loss and danger and returned with strength he could barely comprehend. The widow studied him for a long moment, her eyes flicking briefly to the stars and back to his face. Her gaze seemed to pierce through his thoughts, dissecting every hesitation and every unspoken admission. He felt naked under her attention, yet also oddly safe, as if she were judging not to punish, but to prepare him for what was to come. The hum of the station filled the silence again, and he realized that the encounter was only beginning, and that every choice, every glance, every movement from now on would carry weight. He took a slow breath and met her eyes, trying to steady the rapid beating of his heart, knowing that the first true test of this mission was about to unfold, and that he had no choice but to face it. The young pilot stood frozen as the widow's question echoed in his mind, the words twisting and turning like a storm he could not control. He wanted to look away, but her gaze held him in place, sharp and unwavering, like the tip of a blade pressed against his chest. He could feel the rhythm of his heart in his ears, and the faint tremor in his hands made him aware of how unsteady he truly was. She took another step closer, her movements graceful and precise, as if every gesture was choreographed. By experience, he noticed the subtle angles of her helmet, the way the lights reflected off the surface, highlighting the contours of her suit. Each detail seemed deliberate, designed to command attention and respect. He could not tell if she was testing him or simply existing in her own space and expecting him to adjust. The young pilot opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. He felt the weight of his training clash with the reality of standing before someone who had lived through dangers he could only imagine. His mind scrambled for something appropriate, something honest yet safe, but nothing came. He realized that this was no ordinary encounter. It was a trial of awareness, patience, and restraint. Her eyes softened for a fleeting moment and then hardened again, the transformation subtle but undeniable. He sensed a hint of amusement in her expression, as if she could see his internal struggle, and found it both frustrating and entertaining. He wanted to retreat, but something rooted him to the spot, a mix of fear, curiosity, and the unspoken promise of discovery keeping him anchored. The station hummed around them, the faint vibrations under his feet a reminder of the immense machinery that kept them alive. In the void, he glanced briefly at the stars through the observation window, and felt the vastness of space pressing in from every side. It made him feel small, insignificant, yet somehow part of something larger, something he had not fully understood until now. The widow leaned slightly forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry across the entire deck. "Are you always this distracted?" she asked, her tone both teasing and commanding. He could feel the challenge in her words, the implication that his thoughts mattered as much as his actions, and that control was more important than curiosity. He swallowed hard and tried to steady his breathing. His training kicked in, forcing him to focus on the moment, on the station, on her presence rather than allowing his imagination to wander. His eyes met hers, and he realized that honesty was the only answer that would hold any weight here, even if it made him feel vulnerably. "I did not mean to," he stammered, the words clumsy and awkward but sincere. "I am trying to understand the station, the mission, and you as well." He felt exposed, admitting more than he had intended, yet a small part of him felt relief at speaking at all. The widow studied him silently, a long deliberate pause that felt like hours in the empty observation deck. He could feel her assessing, weighing his words, his demeanor, the very energy he brought into the room. Finally she straightened her posture, a small nod, acknowledging his effort as if granting him a tentative measure of respect. He knew then that the first true barrier had been crossed, and that the real journey was only beginning. The young pilot felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. After the widow nodded, his mind still buzzing from the intensity of the encounter, he took a tentative step backward, then paused, unsure of where to look or what to do. The observation deck felt larger somehow, as if the silence between them had stretched and expanded, filling every corner with unspoken tension. He could hear the faint hiss of the station systems and the distant clatter of machinery, echoing down empty corridors. The widow did not move. Instead she remained still, her presence commanding yet enigmatic, as if she existed on multiple levels at once. He tried to read her expression, the slight tilt of her head, the way her eyes followed him with deliberate interest, but every attempt to decode her only made him more aware of his own uncertainty. He realized that she was a master of control and observation, and he was still learning how to even survive the first layer of her scrutiny. He glanced again at the stars outside the window and felt a pull, a longing for something beyond the station, something infinite and untouchable. He had always dreamed of flying, but standing here in the quiet company of someone who had faced danger and loss made him see that space was more than adventure. It was consequence, it was vigilance, and it was solitude, made tangible and relentless. The widow shifted slightly, and the subtle sound made him startle a little. He reminded himself that every motion here had purpose, and that he must remain alert and attentive. Her eyes lingered on his face as if testing his reaction to the smallest stimulus. He forced himself to breathe slowly, matching the rhythm of the station around him, trying to center himself in the moment, rather than allowing panic or curiosity to overwhelm his senses. He noticed the small details of her suit, the faint scratches along the shoulder plate, the tiny insignias that hinted at victories and losses that he could barely begin to imagine. He wondered how many times she had faced danger and come back alone, or changed and hardened by what she had seen. The thought made him feel both respect and fear, a duality that he had not anticipated. The widow finally spoke, her voice calm and deliberate but carrying a subtle weight. "Do you understand why I asked the question?" She did not wait for an answer, her eyes locking on his. He realized that the question was more about observation than words. It was a test of awareness, patience, and the ability to face truths that were uncomfortable. He nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. The hum of the station filling the spaces where his voice might have been. The silence stretched, and he felt his own mind racing through possibilities, strategies and failures, trying to predict what came next. He realized that the widow was shaping the interaction as much as he was responding to it, and that every thought and movement mattered in that moment. He understood that surviving here was not only about skill or knowledge, it was about attunement to those around him, and to the environment itself. He felt a shiver that was not cold but anticipation and awareness, and a dawning realization that he was at the beginning of something far larger and more intricate than he had ever imagined. The widow stepped closer, her presence filling the deck with a quiet authority. He could feel the tension building again, like a rope tightening around him, and he knew that the next moment would demand more than curiosity, more than courage. It would demand comprehension and trust in the unspoken rules of this strange, isolated world. The young pilot felt his chest tighten as the widow's presence drew closer, a silent force that pressed against his thoughts. He struggled to steady his breathing, the rhythm irregular and tense, as if the station itself had synchronized with his anxiety. He wanted to speak, to fill the silence, yet every word seemed inadequate, fragile, and incapable of conveying the mixture of fear, curiosity, and admiration. Swirling within him, finally, he opened his mouth and let the words stumble out. I did not mean to be distracted," he said, his voice rough from hesitation. "I was not only looking at your suit, I was trying to understand the station, the mission, and everything you represent." He felt exposed, admitting more than he intended, yet a strange relief followed the confession, as if releasing the truth lightened a burden he had not realized he carried. The widow remained silent, her eyes fixed on him, sharp yet unreadable. Her gaze weighed on him with a gravity that made his stomach twist. He realized that honesty alone was not enough. It had to be measured and intentional to survive here. He could feel every heartbeat as if it resonated through the deck, the hum of machinery emphasizing the intensity of the moment. She took a deliberate step closer, and the metallic plates of her suit caught the light, highlighting tiny scratches and dents that told stories of past journeys and hidden battles. He could almost feel the history in the room, the presence of dangers faced and survived, a legacy of courage and loss woven into the very air. He felt small in comparison, yet drawn to the complexity of her experience. Her voice finally cut through the silence, low and deliberate. "Your words are honest," he said, "but honesty alone is not enough. You must understand the weight of the past, the shadows of those who have come before, and the consequences of every choice you make in this place." He could sense the underlying warning that every action, every thought, mattered more than he could imagine, and that failure was not only possible but inevitable if he missed a path. Young pilot swallowed hard. He realized that the confession had opened a door but had not removed the walls surrounding it. He felt the tension coil inside him, a mixture of anticipation and fear that made his movements deliberate, cautious, and uncertain. He wanted to ask questions to understand more, yet he also feared overstepping the invisible boundaries of respect and awareness that the widow demanded. She paused, her gaze shifting for a moment to the stars outside the observation window, and he could see the faint glimmer of memory in her eyes. He sensed fragments of loss, triumph, pain, and endurance passing silently between them, as if the universe itself had conspired to teach him patience and humility. The silence became a bridge connecting their thoughts, a tenuous thread of understanding and vulnerability. Finally he spoke again, his words careful, measured, and sincere. "I want to learn from you to understand the mission and the people you have known, to honor what came before." He felt a small tremor of courage as he admitted this, a recognition that survival was not just about skill but about respect, comprehension, and connection. Widow nodded slowly, acknowledging the effort and the willingness to be vulnerable. The tension in the room softened slightly, though the air remained thick with anticipation. He knew that the confession was a beginning, not an end, and that the journey forward would demand even more awareness, courage, and honesty than he had yet imagined. The widow stood for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the stars outside the observation window, as if seeking a distant memory. She exhaled slowly, and the young pilot noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the weight of stories unspoken pressing on her posture. Then she began to speak, her voice low, deliberate, and tinged with a quiet sadness. "My husband," he said, "never underestimated the void, the dangers that lurk between stars, and the silence that can swallow the strongest." Without warning, she moved closer to the window, her reflection merging with the endless cosmos beyond. The young pilot watched the way her fingers traced a line across the glass almost unconsciously as she continued. "He was the finest pilot I had ever known," she said, a hint of pride slipping through the sorrow, "but he paid the ultimate price. He trusted the technology, the calculations, the certainty of human skill. But the void has no mercy and no patience, and in an instant he was gone, leaving nothing but echoes." The young pilot felt a chill run through him. He imagined the fear, the helplessness, the sudden emptiness that must have followed. Her voice faltered, slightly buffed as she caught it and pressed on. She told him of missions gone wrong, of systems failing, of decisions made too late, and the loneliness that followed, of watching the lights of ships disappear into the dark, knowing there was nothing anyone could do. She spoke not to scare him but to prepare him to understand that space did not forgive mistakes, and that courage was measured not in triumphs but in endurance. He tried to meet her eyes, but they flicked constantly to the stars, as if she were drawing strength from the distant suns. She told him of the times she had survived, where others had perished, of the weight of command and the burden of witnessing friends and partners lost in silence. She explained that every mark on her suit, every scar and dent was a memory, a lesson, a reminder of the consequences of misjudgment and the cost of curiosity. Untempered by respect, the young pilot listened, absorbing every word as if each syllable were a lifeline. He felt the gravity of the stories pressing on him, a mixture of fear, admiration, and determination. Stirring deep within his chest, he realized that understanding her past was not just about empathy, it was a necessary step in preparing for the present and whatever trials lay ahead. She paused, then turned to face him fully, her eyes sharper now, a flicker of resolve shining through the sorrow. "You will make mistakes," she said, "and some will cost more than others, but what matters is that you learn, that you endure, and that you carry the memory of those who came before to guide you." She did not soften her tone. Her words were firm and absolute, yet there was an invitation in them, a challenge to rise to the occasion and prove his worth. The young pilot nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He understood that the widow's story was both a warning and a gift, a revelation of the harsh reality of space, tempered by the chance to rise above it if he could meet it with awareness and courage. He felt a strange sense of connection forming, as if the ghosts of her past were now entwined with his present, guiding pinion. That moment the observation deck felt alive with the presence of history and consequence, and he knew that the next step in his journey would demand more than skill. It would demand endurance, respect, and the willingness to face the void without flinching. The hours passed, and the young pilot and the widow remained in the observation deck, the stars outside, shifting slowly like distant lanterns, guiding their thoughts and reflections. He could feel a subtle change in the air, the tension between them, shifting from challenge to something more intricate and unexpected. The widow moved with quiet grace, checking instruments, adjusting panels, and speaking Occasionally, in a tone that was firm yet laced with humor, he noticed the small smiles that flickered across her face, the brief softening of her gaze, and he realized that beneath the armor of experience there was a complexity. He could barely begin to understand. They talked of missions and calculations, of strategies and survival. He asked questions, cautiously careful not to appear disrespectful, and she answered with precision, her words layered with lessons both practical and philosophical. He learned of the patience required to navigate dangerous sectors, the importance of anticipation and awareness, and the subtle cues that could mean the difference between life and death. The young pilot listened intently, absorbing every detail, as if his very survival depended on it, which in a way it did. Between the lessons there were moments of levity, a joke about misfiring equipment, a playful argument about the best route through a debris field, and he found himself laughing despite the underlying tension. The widow's laughter was rare and sharp, like a signal in the void, and it made him feel the fragility of the walls she had built around herself. He realized that trust was being extended slowly, like a fragile lifeline. Across a chasm of shared experiences, the observation deck lights reflected off the polished metal floor. He noticed the way her movements flowed with confidence and authority. He was fascinated by the contrast between the elegance of her presence and the gravity of her past stories. Every detail, from the tilt of her head to the way she handled the controls, told him more than words ever could, and he felt both awe and an inexplicable sense of belonging in the shared space. She glanced at him suddenly, and the sharpness returned her eyes. Assessing his reactions and composure, he felt a surge of nervous energy, a mix of anticipation and fear, as he realized she was observing not just his actions but his intentions. His heart beat faster, and he struggled to maintain the composure he had cultivated through rigorous training, but he also felt a spark of exhilaration, the thrill of being seen, understood, and challenged all at once. The stars outside continued their silent drift, and the young pilot noticed a subtle shift in the conversation. They began to speak of dreams beyond the station, of ambitions and regrets, of the human element in exploration and survival. He found himself sharing more than he expected, memories of training missions, early failures, the doubts he had kept hidden, and the hopes he carried despite the weight of responsibility. The widow listened without interruption, her gaze unwavering, yet not judging, and he sensed an unspoken acknowledgement of shared understanding. Their bond grew slowly, each word a thread weaving connection and trust across the silent gaps of the station and space itself. By the time the lights flickered, signaling the approaching cycle of the station, he felt a tentative kinship, as if the tension had softened into a careful and compelling alliance. He realized then that their connection was not superficial. It was forged through observation, challenge, and vulnerability, and that the lessons he had received and the trust he had earned would shape every choice he made from this moment forward. Young pilot stood at the center of the observation deck, the hum of the station vibrating through his boots and the endless stars stretching beyond the windows. He felt the weight of the past hours pressing on him, the lessons, the warnings, and the subtle challenges the widow had presented, shaping his thoughts and determination. He realized that leaving now would be a retreat, not just from the station but from the understanding he had begun to grasp. He glanced at the widow, who was adjusting panels, her movements precise and calm yet commanding. He could feel her awareness of him, like a silent current flowing across the room. Her presence was both daunting and inspiring, and he knew that his decision now would define the next steps of his journey. He drew a deep breath, feeling the airlock of responsibility settle on his shoulders, heavier than any physical burden he had ever carried. "I will stay," he said finally, his voice firm, steady, and deliberate, as if speaking the words aloud made them real. The widow paused, her hands frozen for a moment, and then she turned to face him fully, her eyes assessing him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. He felt exposed yet resolute, knowing that the decision to remain was not only about proximity, but about commitment, awareness, and readiness to face the station and the unknown challenges it held. The hum of machinery filled the space between them, a constant reminder of the station alive with purpose and energy. He could feel the subtle vibration of anticipation in the air, as if the walls themselves recognized the significance of the choice. He realized that staying meant embracing every responsibility and risk, understanding that the void did not forgive hesitation, and that curiosity alone was not enough to survive or thrive. The widow walked slowly around him, her gaze never leaving his face, a silent evaluation He noticed the slight tilt of her head, the narrowing of her eyes, the faint shift in her stance, all cues that she was processing. His decision, weighing his sincerity and capacity, he felt both fear and exhilaration. The knowledge that the connection they had forged carried expectations as well as opportunity. They spoke then of tasks and routines, the maintenance of the station, the monitoring of systems, and the preparation for the unknown hazards that could arise. He listened intently, absorbing every detail, each instruction. A lesson wrapped in subtle tests of judgment, patience, and focus. He realized that proving himself was not a singular act but a constant demonstration of awareness and composure. The hours passed. They moved through the station together, performing checks, adjusting instruments, and sharing insights. He began to understand the rhythm of the place, the interplay of caution and action, the delicate balance between human intuition and mechanical precision. His respect for the widow deepened with every gesture, every instruction, and every silent acknowledgement of effort. By the time the station lights dimmed for the cycle change, he felt a sense of belonging grounded in trust and shared purpose. He understood that the decision to stay was more than physical presence. It was acceptance of responsibility and the willingness to grow under the watchful guidance of someone who had seen and endured far more than he ever could alone. The stars outside shifted slowly in their endless drift, and the young pilot realized that the journey ahead would demand vigilance, courage, and humility. Yet, for the first time, he felt prepared and connected to face it alongside the widow, whose presence had become both challenge and anchor. The young pilot stood in the observation deck, the stars outside shifting slowly in their silent procession. He felt the hum of the station beneath his feet, a constant reminder of the machinery and life sustaining systems that surrounded him. He had come far since his first hesitant steps onto the deck, when uncertainty had pressed down on him like a weight he could not lift. Now he felt steadier, stronger, more aware of himself, and the presence of the widow beside him. She moved quietly, adjusting a console, her motions precise and fluid, yet her gaze flicked occasionally to him, as if measuring his composure. He realized that she had been testing him all along, not only in skill but in patience, judgment, and the capacity to observe and endure. He met her eyes and for the first time felt a sense of alignment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that spoke of trust, challenge, and mutual understanding. The young pilot reflected on the lessons he had absorbed, the warnings of the void, the stories of loss and survival that she had shared, and the subtle moments of levity and connection that had allowed him to see her humanity. Beneath the armor of experience, he realized that his mind had grown beyond the initial curiosity that had drawn him here to an awareness that encompassed caution, respect, and the drive to engage with both the station and the widow with deliberate intent. He spoke softly, letting the words carry across the space between them. "I understand now," he said, not in arrogance, but in recognition of the journey so far. The widow glanced at him, a faint smile touching her lips, an expression rare and fleeting but filled with meaning. She nodded slowly, as if affirming that his awareness and efforts had reached a level worthy of acknowledgement. The stars outside stretched endlessly, and the young pilot felt a calm settle over him, a sense of purpose intertwined with the exhilaration of possibility. He realized that understanding was not a singular moment, but an ongoing process that required observation, patience, and the willingness to adapt. He had learned that curiosity without restraint could be dangerous, but curiosity, guided by respect and insight, could open doors and forge connections. Even in the cold expanse of space, they stood together in silence for a long moment, the hum of the station and the shimmer of distant suns filling the observation deck. The young pilot felt a shift within himself, a grounding presence that balanced his excitement with awareness and his admiration with humility. He sensed that the widow recognized this balance, and that the tentative bond they had built had reached a level of mutual respect and quiet understanding. Finally, he turned his gaze fully to the stars, seeing them not just as distant lights but as markers of experience, possibility, and consequence. He felt ready to engage with the mission, the challenges of the station, and the unspoken lessons of the widow in a way that was conscious, deliberate, and thoughtful. He knew that the journey ahead would continue to test him, but he also knew that he had learned the first essential truth of survival. In this place, the widow looked at him once more, her expression softening with approval and challenge combined, and he understood without words that the connection they shared had transformed from uncertainty and tension to understanding and shared purpose. The observation deck felt alive with unspoken acknowledgement, and the young pilot realized that his mind was now focused on far more than curiosity alone, and that he was prepared to face the void with clarity, courage, and the guidance of someone who had already endured its deepest shadows.